Welcome. This is our January edition of This Month in Cybersecurity. Our goal is to look back at the stories from the month of January, sort of pick out 4 stories that were in the news that might be relevant to us as small and mid-sized businesses, and indicate what happened. How did it happen? What controls were missing, and most importantly, how can you benefit as an organization or prevent that sort of thing from occurring? So we're trying to focus this on you, and certainly with election season behind us, you would think the level of cyber attacks is decreasing, but no, in fact, things still appear to be on the rise. So let's, without further ado, let's kind of dive into not only some of those stories, but bringing back a level. As an organization, you're chartered to come up with a security strategy, and like many organizations, your security strategy likely just focuses on technical controls, certainly as one aspect of it. Nobody had to tell you to put a firewall in for you to believe that, hey, I should probably put one in. That's a good idea, right? That's a level of a technical control, but additionally, I think it's important you know about people controls, things like security awareness, right? And making sure that your employees are the strongest link in your security chain. That would be the example of a people control. Or maybe you have process control, things like dual control or change management. Those are essentially good strategies for having good process around your security. But in general, controls is certainly one aspect of several as to how people develop a security strategy. Obviously, if they get hit with or have an incident, they'll put a control in place because of that incident. Yet another way that people tend to come at security strategies is from a governance perspective. It's very possible that some of your data or all of your data is subject to a regulating body, and possibly auditing from, let's say, HIPAA if you're in healthcare, or PCI if you're in financial transactions, or maybe just FedRAMP if you're in government. So certainly governance comes at us from a compliance perspective, but it also comes at it from people's belief that there are good security models already developed out there, things like COSO frameworks or NIST, and they subscribe to those frameworks as ways to uncover what they're missing, and maybe do some self-audits, or maybe you have external firms that assist you in evaluating your posture relative to a good standard such as COSO or NIST. A third area that we'd like to discuss, as the kind of wheel went round, is the idea of risk assessments, or what we'll call data significance. Really, by focusing in on the data that you own and the data that you're chartered to manage, you can prioritize your security efforts and spends and strategy around that data. You'll see that things like identity pull out from that data and really cross across a number of controls that you might be implementing, and all of this surrounded by governance and frameworks. So this is kind of our view of security strategy, and it's in this view that we kind of take you to this month's the January edition of In the News. And this month, as I mentioned, no shortage of stories out there available for us to pull from. The 4 stories we're going to focus in on. First and foremost is a hotel. This is a very high-end hotel by its looks. I think this is based in Austria. And we'll talk about the issues they had in January and how they decided to go public with some of those issues. Made some newsworthy stories. We'll also talk about customers that were impacted by QuickBooks scam that was out there. We'll talk about the scam itself. Possibly your organization is leveraging QuickBooks for managing some of their financials, or have instances of that within your financial areas, and may be highly relevant to you. Third area, this comes from our own customer database about a real incident that occurred, and what its implications were for that firm. How did they recover from it? What did their response plan look like? And let's just take a look under the covers on that. And the fourth story we're going to cover is one that was a targeting effort towards HR. Many people have HR departments within their firms, and it's interesting to note that HR is of particular risk only because they're very accustomed to opening up emails from people outside of the organization. unlike maybe people within IT or within finance that have known people that they work with, HR is particularly suspect to emails from outside, applicants and so forth. And so we'll talk about a story that occurred in that space. So without further ado, let's dive in on the hotel story. This came out late in the month. There were some conflicting stories about it that came out later, but ultimately this is a very high-end 180 seat or 180 room hotel. It's a 4 or 5 star hotel, beautiful lakeside setting in Austria. This is the opening weekend of their winter season, so you can imagine this is the high time for them to make a fair amount of money. Pack the rooms, fully loaded, waiting lists and so forth. And lo and behold, their reservation system and cash desk system were subject to ransomware. Okay? Ransomware on a system like that might be impactful, and we can try and relate this to maybe your file system or something. But think about this from a hotel perspective. The guests were unable to get inside of their hotel room. So we had 180 high-paying guests, all excited about their weekend, unable to get into their hotel room. So they weren't locked in, they were locked out. And in this particular case, to kind of quote the story, neither police nor insurance was really going to help them in this case, right? They had an emergency problem and they needed a response plan. Now, in this particular case, they went back and looked, and it had all the traditional metrics you would see. There's something called an attack where maybe someone opens up an email. There's something called a dropper and a payload, and there's a pretty straightforward method by which ransomware attackers come in, develop code that is subject to later on exploit, open up remote sessions, inject the ransomware onto the systems that they want to, and ultimately extract cash, which is the end game here. So this happened actually twice to them. They actually ended up paying the ransomware, and then it occurred to them again from a different person because they had not prevented technically this from occurring again. So some of the protections that could be done for ransomware, and I think we'll dive into some detail on this, but in their particular case, things like a next generation firewall are certainly is a technical way to assist. Things like looking at events that are occurring and looking for suspicious communication patterns or behaviors within your organization is another way. Having a rehearsed response plan. What's going to happen if, and if you're at a bank, how are your tellers able to dispense cash or take on a transaction should the systems be down? That's a very common incident response plan that financial institutions have. What do you have? What would happen if your organization couldn't get into a file server or couldn't email? Are there alternative ways that they could go, which is a business continuity plan? And who should, what's the response team look like, and so forth? And all of these are part of a response plan that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. In terms of a controls review, I guess just to dive into a little bit of detail back for them, a lot of people don't know the difference between a next generation firewall and a traditional firewall. So we're not here to pontificate upon what that is, but just kind of look at this graphic a little bit and get a sense for whether you're the owner of a traditional firewall or next generation firewall. And maybe you don't know, but certainly provides you some criteria to go ask. Does your firewall know who's going where, and is it logging and recording all the events that are occurring? Or is it, a 3-year-old firewall and you're really just kind of looking at ports? I think the question I like the most is, what is your firewall seeing right there in the middle of the graphic? Additionally, there's things like evaluation of behaviors, and certainly there are systems out there called SIM systems that will do a lot of things that are not being done today often, looking at account lockouts and lateral movements and a lot of the traditional behaviors that those payloads and droppers that are signatures of ransomware are going after. And so ask you to take a look and kind of dive into a couple technical controls that can be put in place for that. And we'll talk more about the people and process controls in some of our future stories here. All right, the second story was on QuickBooks, and again, this might be highly relevant to you if you're leveraging this at an organizational level. What happened here is this was effectively a spear phishing campaign, or a good example of that. someone had done some homework and found out who had purchased QuickBooks and essentially canvassed them and gathered the email addresses, let's say, of all the people that had registered QuickBooks and sent out a spear phishing campaign, which is effectively just a phishing campaign, but it's targeted. And so someone had done some homework. Maybe it was a group of people. I were unsure of who the source was, but ultimately this email said in the subject line, QuickBooks support, change request. And the person was receiving an email that said, I own QuickBooks and there's a change request. And later on in the email it basically says your organization's name has changed. Click the link if it's not correct. And you're like, wait a second, my name didn't change. Uh-oh, what's going on? I better click this link. And if your people controls are not in place and people are not highly suspicious of the link, if it's targeted and people are resonating that, hey, they knew that I own QuickBooks, this must be real. Ultimately what happened when people clicked the link is malware was dropped on the machine with a keystroke logger to be able to record keystrokes so that when they're logging in on systems with credentials, those could be provided back. And a remote session was established where effectively the payload would allow people to remotely access the computer and drop unsuspecting files onto a workstation. So the goal here was to raise your people awareness from a security awareness perspective. Start looking at your network activity, monitoring, looking for the suspicious payload, similar to what the hotel should have needed. Possibly looking into other technical controls like enhanced email protection. What this means is the ability to scrutinize links as well as attachments for either known signatures, which is typically what a lot of systems have today, as well as unknown and potentially dangerous ones, which is what some of the enhanced systems have. And then also having an incident response plan should you get impacted by some of the ransomware. So here's a few more details regarding those. I won't read all these to you, but certainly when you receive the PowerPoint as a PDF, you'll have these links available to you. But we chat more extensively about technical, people, and process controls to help prevent ransomware. We actually have an 8-part ransomware blog series in the middle of the page there that you might be interested in, just to kind of learn more about the facts. What's going on in our industry? Why is this occurring? What can I do to prevent it? What awareness should I make my end users aware of? And at the end of that 8-part ransomware blog, we intend to have a webinar, I think in the month of March, that will kind of capstone all of that, as well as a workbook to kind of walk through and help you determine what your security risk is relative to it. So people, process, and technology are all aspects of this, including back to the next generation firewall and so forth. Our third story comes right from our customer database. We had a customer that reached out to us actually it was in very late December timeframe, but we're calling this a January story only because it really got wrapped up in January. Ultimately, this was an insurance provider. They were in a position where they were acquiring a small 15-person agency, and the president of that agency had received an email, a legitimate email regarding email for accessing banking services. So he chose to go out there and follow the email, and that thread was fine. Later on, as it turned out in the day, he got a fake email, and it went to it directed him back to the banking website and had him entering credentials for his banking services. Okay, the fake banking website basically stated that the account was locked and that it was needed to contact technical support, and a phone number was provided. So the phone number and the link were accessed, and long story short is a session was started up with on the computer, and it was shortly thereafter that when the employee provided notification of what had occurred, that people were noticing that some of the directories were not accessible on the file server by the admin account. Additionally, some strange things had started occurring on the workstation. Well, at this point, we have a 15-person agency that has some files that ultimately look like they're inaccessible by the administrator account, as well as some erratic behaviors on the workstations, and the file server happened to have their customer database also on it with all of the agency information. So they were unsure if they were in a situation where they had to contact all of their customers. They were unsure if they had been breached. And long story short is everybody wanted to know, right? From the agency to the company that was acquiring them and so forth. And so ultimately what we followed, and when Peters and Associates was contacted, is we followed a two-pronged plan. Okay, we had an operational plan to make sure that the 15-person agency, this was a Friday afternoon when this occurred, and on Monday morning when 15 people are coming back in, we want to make sure that operationally they can continue to do work. Well, should they do work on their existing laptops? Should they be using their existing server? How can we make those employees effective? And there certainly was an operational plan put into place and resurrected so that on Monday morning everything was satisfied and fine. Secondly, there's a need to answer in a declarative way to the buying organization as well as to the agency itself. Do we have a problem? And make some declarative statements. The board would like to know. The executives want to know. There may be a legal component if there may be a notification need to the end customers if their data was accessed, as many of us have seen in the news today. There might be financial. Was there financial loss of any means? So all of this needed to be determined, and we have leveraged our forensic relationships to undergo a forensics exercise also. So all of this was, I think, a good part of a good exercise to kind of look through. And if we look in the upper right, I'll try to use the highlighter here. At some of the steps that are relevant for an incident response plan. Preparation, right? Having an incident response plan, and in our particular case, we used a generic incident response plan that we have to outline our sense of activities and give some direction to what appeared to be a directionless a customer without an incident response plan and no direction. We used our skills to evaluate and kind of do detection and analysis on their network to determine root cause, what had happened, and working with a forensics company, did also some imaging as well as the containment, validating that whether there was exposure or not, and the recovery efforts, which really operate under our operations. And then at the end, sat down with the board and executives, had a declarative statements regarding what had occurred, the timeline under which it had occurred, and whether customer notification was necessary. In this particular case, happy news. It turned out not to be an incident of major proportions. Obviously, the major gap here was the security awareness, kind of down at the employee level. But the fact that the admins were locked out actually turned out to be a non-event at the end of the story, and no customer notifications were due. I think the real exercise there was having an incident response plan in place. Could have helped prevent some of the forensics exercises and costs associated with that had they been prepared in the beginning. So it's kind of a pay me now, pay me later. I think that it's very logical to have incident response plans in place, tested and rehearsed. Our fourth and final story that we're talking about here was really predominantly around the HR. As mentioned before, HR has a need to kind of open emails from unknown people. So they're particularly suspect to this event that occurred in the month of January here in early January. Effectively, an email went out to what appeared to be HR representatives from organizations. It had two attachments. Okay, the first attachment was a PDF with a cover letter that was as realistic as any cover letter you've ever gotten. It had the proper dates, names, was well worded, and so forth. And any HR professional looking at that might look at that cover letter and say, okay, this applicant looks like they might have some potential. Maybe they have open positions or not. The second attachment was actually an Excel file. People might go, that's kind of weird that it's an Excel file. I was expecting a doc, but I'm going to open this anyway. They open it, and the first thing they're prompted with is enable content, as there are some macros in the Excel file that needed to be enabled. Well, if you want to see the data that's in there and you believe that this applicant might be worth their salt, you're certainly not trained enough maybe to know that enable content for macros could be a dangerous activity, even though you were warned and prompted by Excel. You click enable content and immediately you're in a situation where your HR data, not only on the workstation but also on the server, is locked up. Okay, this is called GoldenEye. It was the ransomware that was being used, and at this point they were asking for 1.3 bitcoins, or in today's dollars, about $1,000. The thing that's interesting about bitcoins that we have uncovered for our customers is that the bitcoin process and the ability to pay or not pay is certainly a subject of great debate. We have blog posts that are up that we could point to that are on our website under peters.com/blog that talk about pay or not pay. That's again part of our 8-part series on ransomware. Additionally, of additional interest is things about bitcoins. Bitcoin process to set up to pay via Bitcoin is at least a 3-day process. So if you're in a situation similar to the hotel where you've got people locked out of the doors, you don't have 3 days, okay, to get these things set up. So what we've done on our behalf of our customers is we've actually set up Bitcoin accounts as part of a managed incident response plan so that we could, if instructed to do so, pay on behalf of an organization that has decided to go that route. So these are just some of the things that are part of the preparatory steps for incident response plans and being able to react accordingly. On the flip side from HR, kind of a shorter story, but a little bit analogous, is as we're kind of going into the ransomware bubble of things, it seems, there were several databases, when I say several, there were 50,000 databases in January. If you looked at the beginning of the month, these databases were called Mongo databases, which is just a vendor, if you will. And many organizations hold these databases for purposes of, either customer accounts or just various information about customers. Well, a security flaw was found in the Mongo databases where they were publicly exposed and subject to a security flaw. Well, once that security flaw was found out, the 50,000 Mongo databases that were publicly accessible on the internet went to 20,000 almost overnight. 30,000 Mongo databases were locked up in a single evening with ransomware. And these databases impacted, as an example, Verizon. Had some 1.5 million people and customers that were impacted with one of their databases. So you can imagine 30,000 databases. It's just an extraordinary amount of information that was locked up and subject to database level ransomware. And what's kind of interesting here is that the provider who found the leak was the first to the market to lock up these databases. But then as other ransomware providers found out about the security flaw, they double locked, or they took over the other person's ransomware and said, no, we'd like to collect money for theirs. So there was a little bit of a turf war regarding who you would pay to get your database unlocked. And in fact, after unlocking with one, you may be subject to another one coming by and locking again had you not fixed the security flaw. So turf wars ultimately were part of the story there, and I just kind of want to let you know about the enormity, if you will, of the exposure of not only file systems, whether they're done through an HR department, but also at a database level, if possible. So 4 stories: hotel, QuickBooks, the insurance company, and then the HR. All of them had gaps, if you will, on what we call our 7 controls on the left-hand side. And the goal was to kind of try and find ways to fill those gaps in. Certainly these organizations have hopefully done their due diligence since then to kind of pre-fill those gaps. Our hope is that in highlighting some of these, it can help you get some awareness regarding how to fill those in sooner rather than later. I'll leave you with the idea that information is good, and right now, as part of a series, obviously on the right-hand side we've got our blog site, which has got that 8-part ransomware, as well as several other blogs. We're putting out about 3 or 4 a week with what we think is relevant, good information for you. And on the left-hand side, we've got events similar to this one. We'll be doing this at the end of February, on February 28th. We've also got some other seminars that we're doing around HR portals, and the up at the top, transforming your organization using kind of data analytics and evaluating not only the impact of IoT to track, measure, and produce data, but also looking at dashboards to garner good decisions out of that data. And so that's an in-person event, I believe, at a restaurant nearby here in Oak Brook. So We hope that you can attend either one of our events, check out our blogs. We hope this was informative to you, and certainly follow up with any questions either in queue or afterwards. We're here for you as a resource, and look forward to helping.